Hello friends, welcome back to your channel Tiger Moon. Last episode ended when the children's families asked Ramin to hold afternoon classes for their kids, but Ramin, who was afraid of the darkness around the school, tried to convince them otherwise and ultimately failed. If you're ready, let's continue the story. As I said, the families eventually got their way. Not everyone wanted the extra classes, but a few families seemed to think that an extra hour and a half of lessons would magically turn their children into professors. In the end, it was decided that the 5th and 6th graders would come to school at 4 in the afternoon. The doctor kept encouraging me, telling me to look at the bright side of things. It was around late autumn. I had extra classes 2 days a week. One day, during a lesson with the 5th graders, only 4 students showed up. When I asked about their classmates, they told me the others had gone to help their families in the orchards. The emptier the classroom became, the more nervous I felt. About half an hour before class ended, one of the boys asked for permission to use the restroom. 15 minutes passed, and he still hadn't returned. I grew concerned, but I stayed in the classroom. Then I heard the sound of several people running past the window. A chill ran through me. I knew something was wrong. I stepped outside. A piece of plastic water pipe was leaning against the wall of the hallway. Hoping it would give me some courage, I picked it up and headed toward the restrooms. The schoolyard was almost completely dark. As I got closer, I noticed one of the restroom doors was shut. I called the boy's name, but there was no answer. I walked up to the door and called again. A weak voice came from inside. "Sir, is that really you?" Annoyed, I replied, "Yeah, who else would it be? Did you fall asleep in there?" The boy burst into tears. "No, sir. Someone's outside." The moment he said that, I knew my suspicions had been right. Before I could react, I suddenly felt that someone was standing directly behind me. If it weren't for trying to keep my dignity in front of the students, my scream probably would have been heard by my entire family miles away. Slowly, I turned around. There was nobody there. I let out a sigh of relief and told the boy to open the door. When he stepped outside, he looked terrified. He told me that before entering the restroom, several small figures had chased him. Frightened, he had jumped inside and locked the door. Together we walked back toward the classroom. Before he had even reached his desk, our smartest girl asked him why he had been crying. The other students thought I had punished him for being late, but the boy loudly announced, "The little dwarfs chased me. Sir came and saved me." By "sir," he meant me. Those few words were enough to throw our tiny 4-student classroom into chaos. None of the kids could stay seated any longer. Seeing that everything was falling apart, I ended the class early. Even the fear of the Gorzads couldn't stop the children from being happy about the early dismissal. To make sure nothing happened to them on the way home, I walked with them all the way down the hill. Before leaving, the boy turned to me and said, "Teacher, don't go back to the school alone. They only show themselves to people who are alone." Although I was practically vibrating with fear, I nodded calmly and headed back uphill. Unfortunately, the doctor wasn't at the clinic either. When I called him, he told me he had gone into the village to treat an elderly woman. I decided to run to the school as quickly as possible, grab my belongings and get out of there. By the time I arrived, the entire schoolyard was swallowed by darkness. Talking to myself just to stay calm, I hurried toward the hallway. The hallway was even worse than the yard. In that darkness, it felt like an endless cave. I rushed into my classroom and switched on the light. At top speed, I started gathering my papers and books. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw someone peeking around the doorway. An electric shock ran through my entire body. I spun toward the door. All I saw was a mass of long hair disappearing around the corner. I was so shocked that I collapsed into a chair. My heart was pounding wildly. I could even feel my eyebrows twitching in rhythm with my heartbeat. I no longer had the strength to leave, nor the courage. I don't know how many minutes I sat there when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside the hallway. I wasn't sure whether someone was coming toward me or what was coming toward me. The only thing I could do was sit there like a paralyzed man and wait for my fate. A few moments later, a medium-sized figure appeared in the darkness. Thank God it wasn't a Gurzad. It was the old bathhouse keeper, Haj Yadola, carrying a sickle. He had come to help. When he saw me, he walked over and asked, "Teacher, right, what happened? Did you see something again?" Feeling a little better, I asked, "How did you know?" Helping me to my feet, the Haj Yadola replied, "Abul Fazl told me. He said a Gurzad had been seen at the school. I got worried and came to help." Took a deep breath. "God bless you. I'm glad you came, but don't tell the kids." Together, we locked up the school and headed back to the clinic. We sat there for a while, and eventually the doctor returned. The next day, the parents came and took up a large portion of class time. The story about the dwarves had frightened them badly. This wasn't something that happened often. In fact, only a few men had ever claimed to see Gurzads, and only at night. I secretly hoped the extra classes would be cancelled. Instead, the village imam suggested that we hold the classes inside the mosque. The children were disappointed. I was thrilled. The extra money would remain and we'd be safe. What place could be better than the house of God? Usually, by the time class ended, the call to prayer would begin. After prayer, the doctor and I would return uphill together. Everything was going smoothly, and I found myself counting down the days until winter. It had been nearly 3 months since I had taken a single day of leave. The school principal had promised that during exam season, when the school was nearly empty, someone would replace me for a week or two. It was late autumn. One day, while I was teaching, the doctor suddenly appeared. He looked worried, and he seemed to be in a hurry. I stepped outside the classroom. He told me that his mother's condition had worsened and that he needed to get to Tehran immediately. I was devastated, partly because of his mother's illness, and partly because he was leaving. Before he left, he told me that Muhammad Javad would stay with me while he was gone. We hugged goodbye, and the doctor left. After school, I headed back to the clinic feeling disappointed. A few hours passed and there was still no sign of Muhammad. About an hour after the evening prayer, I heard a motorcycle enter the clinic yard. It was Muhammad. He told me he had been waiting for me at the mosque so we could walk back together. But the doctor was gone and I didn't have any extra classes that day. On our first night at the clinic, Muhammad suggested that we pack up our things and move to the school. At first, I thought he was joking, but he looked serious and said that some people in the village, the kind who spent their days spreading gossip, had started talking behind our backs. The clinic was full of equipment and supplies. He suggested that we lock everything up and spend the night at the school instead. His reasoning left me uncertain. "Come on, Muhammad," I said. "That place is dangerous." Muhammad shrugged. "If something wants to come after us, it'll come here, too. Burn in your own hell if you want, but don't walk into, other people's paradise." Honestly, I didn't care much about what strangers in the village thought of me, especially since Muhammad insisted there weren't many of them. But I wanted him to feel comfortable and stay with me, so I agreed. We gathered our belongings and headed to the school. The moment the cold hallway door opened, I wished I were dead. I found myself thinking that I wished I had never met the doctor in the first place. Then I wouldn't have gotten used to having him around. The teacher's room was freezing. Since nobody had used it for a long time, the heater wasn't running either. Muhammad suggested that we survive the night somehow and bring a heater from storage the next day. Worse than the cold was the hunger. Mohammed wasn't in much better shape than I was. Thankfully, he had brought food. He pulled a package of pasta from his basket, and suddenly life seemed worth living again. Because of the cold, I sat beside him near the camping stove in the hallway. He looked exhausted. His eyes kept closing. To keep him awake, I tried starting a conversation. Out of all the topics in the world, I somehow chose ghosts and spirits. "Mohammed," I asked, "have you ever seen a jinn?" He practically jumped. He looked at the watch on his wrist. "What?" I repeated the question. Running a hand through his messy hair, he said, "Honestly, I'm not sure. I've never clearly seen anything. Besides, they're not everywhere." I asked him about the Gurzads and the stories Haj Abdullah had told me. Mohammed stood up, picked up the pot and walked toward the sink. From there he replied, "They're not jinn. Take my advice. If you ever see one, kick it." I stared at him. "What? Don't do that." The doctor said the previous teacher got into trouble because of things like that. The moment he heard that, he burst out laughing. Curious, I left the warmth of the stove and stood near the restroom door. "What? Why are you laughing?" Mohammed carried the pitchin, empty pot back to the stove and poured some oil into it. Then he returned to the sink, grabbed the pasta and continued cooking. As he worked, he said, "Rashid's case was different. That guy had 1,000 schemes running in this village. He and that lunatic Akbar went looking for treasure in the Kanat. Years ago, some strange man used to live around here." I interrupted him and said that Haj Yadola had already told me the entire story about the sorcerer. Mohammed nodded. "Good. Then hear this too. I think Rashid tricked Akbar and ran away. Why else would he disappear? Come on, a couple of hairy little dwarfs scared him away. Rashid? Compared to him, a donkey looked like a professor." For the first time in a while, I felt hopeful. "So you think the stories about the Gurzads aren't true? They don't really have any powers?" I stared into their eyes for 10 seconds once and got a fever. Muhammad pursed his lips. I don't know enough about them to say for sure, but I think Rashid left because of treasure. Akbar chased after him more than the village council ever did." I thought about it for a moment. The more I added things up, the more it seemed possible. I nodded quickly. "The clever Rashid even fooled the doctor. So all those stories about invisible needles and attacks were just excuses." Muhammad laughed. "That's my theory. At least I hope so. It'd be pretty satisfying if Akbar ended up getting burned by the whole thing." After dinner, Muhammad placed the stove inside the room and crawled under his blanket. I, however, turned it off. I was more afraid of suffocating from the fumes than freezing to death. The next morning, Muhammad was still asleep when I woke up. With a sigh, I got ready for another school day. Around 9 o'clock, I stepped out of the classroom to ring the bell. Technically, I could have simply announced the break from inside the class, but I had always enjoyed ringing the bell. As soon as it rang, the students poured out of the hallway like a Tatar invasion. That's when I saw Muhammad walking toward me, smiling. He still looked half asleep. When he reached me, he grinned. "Mr. Ramin, are you a bell addict too?" Rashid was the same way. Feeling slightly encouraged, I invited him into the office. One of the villagers had brought me a bowl of local cheese. By my calculations, it would have lasted me until the end of my service. But the moment Muhammad took his first bite, I changed my mind. I immediately regretted inviting him to breakfast. Trying to soften the damage, I said, God bless these villagers." Ignoring me completely, Muhammad took another bite. "It's their duty. A teacher shouldn't have to worry about food." After asking him a few questions, I learned that the district school regularly sent food supplies for the village teacher. Apparently, Muhammad had no interest in eating those supplies. The donated cheese, however, was a completely different story. After breakfast, he said goodbye and left for his distillery work. From that day on, I decided that even on days without extra classes, I would go to the mosque so we could walk back together. A few more days passed and December arrived. The weather kept getting colder, but there was still no rain. That puzzled me. A village that green shouldn't have been able to survive without water. Since the school didn't have a television, the long autumn nights passed painfully slowly. Eventually, boredom got the better of us. One night, Muhammad stood up from beside the oil heater and said, "Want to go somewhere?" I looked at him in surprise. "At this hour?" He pointed to his watch. "It's still early. Come on, I want to catch some fish." Ever since I had learned that the village was home to creatures called gorzads, I had become suspicious of everything. "Fish?" I asked. "You mean those little fish in the irrigation canals?" Muhammad put on his coat and laughed. "No, real fish. Carp." The way he talked about the carp living in the canal was tempting. It had been a long time since I had eaten a proper meal. The little money I received every month certainly didn't allow for luxury. The moment I agreed, Muhammad lit up with excitement and ran to the office. A few moments later, he returned carrying a basket, a strainer, and a cooking pot. Just in case, I grabbed the plastic pipe leaning beside the hallway, and together we left the school. A moment later, I realized he was heading toward the top of the hill. "Muhammad," I called nervously. "Do you know what's up there?" He smirked. "Of course I do. Our fields are up there. Come on, I told you not to worry." When we reached the top of the hill, a 6-magnitude earthquake seemed to pass through my body. The cemetery stretched along the hillside beneath the moonlight like a living thing. I hurried to catch up with Muhammad, and together we started walking down the other side. Trying to distract myself from dark thoughts, I asked, "Do you come here alone often?" Balancing the pot on his head, he replied, "No, God comes with me." Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the gravestones standing silently. Every now and then, some of them seemed to move. I refused to turn my head toward them, because I was convinced that whatever was moving wasn't actually a gravestone. The farther we descended, the newer the graves became. After countless prayers and whispered verses, we finally reached the plain below. Several kilometers away, a mountain range stretched across the horizon like a giant wall. After walking beneath the moonlight for nearly a kilometer, I heard the sound of rushing water. Muhammad changed direction and headed toward a single dead tree. Eventually, a canal appeared. It looked nothing like the canals in the city. Water rushed through it with surprising force, flowing from the upper valley toward the lower plain. Muhammad pointed toward a small wooden bridge. Let's go over there. That's where they hang out." We hadn't reached the bridge yet when I noticed several dark shapes dart beneath it. I groaned in disappointment. "They ran away, Muhammad." Still examining the tree branches, he replied, "They're fish, not birds. They'll come back." A moment later, he jumped up and snapped off a dead branch. After removing the smaller branches, he fashioned a long pole. Then he handed it to me. "Stick this under the bridge and stir the water. Force the fish to swim against the current." I knelt beside the canal and did as he asked. It was exhausting work, but the thought of eating fresh fish gave me motivation. After a while, I grew bored. Nothing's happening. Annoyed, Muhammad put down the basket and took my place. The moment he started, chaos erupted beneath the bridge. He was thrashing the pole around like he was launching torpedoes underwater. I stared into the water. Suddenly, a fish shot out from beneath the bridge. Excited, I swung the basket underneath it and launched it onto the bank. Thankfully, the canal wasn't very deep. Knocking fish out of the water turned out to be surprisingly easy. As Muhammad cheered, a deep growl erupted behind us. I jumped to my feet and spun around. Before I could say anything, Muhammad shouted, "Run! Get into the tree!" Terrified, We scrambled up the trunk as fast as we could. Moments later, several wolves emerged from the darkness. One of them was completely black and far larger than the others. It stood on its hind legs and tried to reach us. Thankfully, we had climbed high enough. After failing to get to us, the wolves grabbed 3 of the fish in their jaws and disappeared into the darkness. Half an hour later, we cautiously climbed back down. Muhammad grabbed the basket and cooking pot. We need to run back to the hill. They might be waiting in ambush. With the plastic pipe still in my hand, I ran through the freezing night. The outside of my body was cold, but sweat soaked my clothes underneath. It was a miserable feeling, and every time I remembered the fish we'd lost, it made me even more miserable. Still, staying alive was like more important. Wow. About 10 minutes later, we reached the base of the hill. Only then did Muhammad finally relax and I was able to catch my breath. We kept walking until we reached the school, and the moment we opened the school door, I froze. The hallway door was standing wide open. Terrified, I called out to Muhammad and we rushed inside. Something was terribly wrong. Someone had entered while we were gone. The entire room had been turned upside down. Well friends, that's the end of tonight's story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video and help it reach more people. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a poet tonight. Stay under God's protection. Sincerely, Tiger Moon.